I'm Tony Capizzi. I'm a judge from the other Montgomery County, and that is Montgomery County in Ohio. I'm a juvenile and family court judge, and I'm also on the board of Stewards. The title of this presentation is Cross-Sector Data Sharing in Action, Opportunities and Challenges. I come from a strange perspective because so much you involved in the health industry and healthcare. I'm doing the groundwork every day in my court, focusing on children and families. And what you all create, I implement every day in how I decide the lives and futures for children and their families. I'm also here from the perspective of I'm going to be president of the National Juvenile and Family Court Judges Association next month. So I'll be speaking for all the judges in the United States on issues that affect children and families and how we work to do a better job to protect them. I run the largest drug treatment court in Ohio for juveniles. I had to open up this past year because of the opioid issue. I started a family treatment court for those parents who are addicted to drugs, and these days it's almost always heroin or some other opiate. I'm also starting a juvenile mental health court, which I call a life health court. And so the challenges that I see every day are what you're talking about in a variety of perspectives. And we have an amazing panel here to talk about what we can do, in my case, to help me focus on the children and families that I serve. I'm so thrilled there are so many new people here this year, because last year was the first time I had the chance to come. And I'm not an IT person. I'm learning, but it's a struggle. But I came here last year. I made a connection with Martin Dugan, who is here now. In the old days, he was with IBM last year. As a result of that relationship he and I built since last year, I am now the only juvenile court in the United States. And we are piloting and testing IBM Watson for treatment courts, specialty courts in the United States. Pretty amazing stretch of a year and what we've been able to accomplish over a year, and how I've seen success already in implementing all these issues that can help my family and my kids. So that's the topic. We all talk in large numbers, but I see little kids, 3 months old, 4 years old, who come into the system that may be drug addicted when they're born, or there may be children at 12 who are already heroin addicted. And so this is real life to me every day. And so as you create these changes, you create these models, you make my life so much better. But the reality is, our goal is to help the children and families of the United States. And so I'm going to introduce my panel, let them each introduce themselves. This is going to be a very laid-back kind of panel where I'm going to ask them some questions and try and pull out answers. We'll go for about an hour, and then I'm going to open it up to you all to see if you have any questions for the panel or me. And we have just like 2 or 3 slides that Mike's going to show at one point somewhere along the way. So let's go ahead and start. Mary-Sara, why don't you go?
Hi, I'm Mary-Sara.
Oh.
I'm Mary-Sara Jones, and I'm the industry leader for Health and Human Services with IBM. And I've been working with data sharing, I guess, across my entire career. And I started out in healthcare, working with EMRs and EHRs. And then I moved into social programs. And I'm really excited that today we're talking about data sharing really across the ecosystem. And we've got health and social and criminal justice and education, and how do we bring it all together. So I'm very pleased to be here.
I'm Mike Wilkening, Undersecretary of Health and Human Services for California. And in California, the Health and Human Services Agency is an umbrella agency that includes the departments of healthcare services, so our Medicaid department, social services, public health, and several others. We started working on open data about 3 years ago, and that's now kind of morphed into some of our internal data use and building use cases around sharing data across the departments, and now starting to look outside of the agency as well. So really happy to be here.
Good morning. My name is Richard Gold, and I'm with Stewards of Change. And for the last 6 years, I've been working with jurisdictions on implementing data exchange and data information as well as how to meet the requirements of confidentiality and enable the data to be shared. Pleasure to be here.
Richard is kind enough to share his mic in addition to his thoughts about data sharing. I'm Alison, and humor, okay, good. I'm Alison Rein, I'm a senior director at AcademyHealth. I've had the pleasure of working on health information technology and exchange policy for about 15 years, but it's really in the last 8 or 9 years that I focused on exchange at the community level and how different community partners can come together, sometimes within healthcare, sometimes straddling multiple different sectors, to share data to solve a shared challenge. So for the last couple of years, I've run a program on behalf of the ONC called the Community Health Peer Learning Program, and that's really oriented around a discrete population health challenge that was identified by the community and where the communities have come together with different partners from different sectors to share data to address those challenges. And really happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. You know, I'm from Montgomery County in Ohio, I'm about 40 minutes east of the Indiana border. I'm about an hour and 15 minutes north of the Kentucky border, and I'm about 3 hours south of Canada. But the reality is, what that means is I have families in my court who cross back and forth from Kentucky to Ohio, from Indiana to Ohio, and from, frankly, even Ohio to Michigan and to Pennsylvania. And so I can have a family in my court system, a parent who's drug addicted, who goes to see a caseworker, and the caseworker says to them, you know, you're in trouble. We're going to take your kid when the baby's born. And so that child, and the caseworker will never admit that they do this, and Richard may understand this, but the caseworker may say, you know what, if you go across the line to Indiana, it's a 40-minute drive, you won't be in the system. So no one will take your third child at this point. And so that family that mother goes to Indiana, again, a 40-minute drive from my court, and I don't know what happens, or vice versa. A mother in Indiana comes to Ohio and she's heroin addicted, and I gotta say, I can't get to that data because it's in another state. And so as I look at those kinds of things, and I think Mary-Sara brought it up, that I'm looking at how do I interact with health providers, other court providers? How do I work with the courts, prosecutors, defense attorneys, all these different systems, and how do we exchange information? How do we get everybody to share so that I can save that baby's life? That's the practical approach to it. So, as you all have your careers, and Richard, you are probably, hey, I heard he's the oldest, but I don't believe it. I just think he's got the whitest beard. All right, you have great experience in the state of Pennsylvania on how to interact with individuals and data sharing, the complex nature of courts, the private sector, and how does that interaction work? How are you able to get them to work together, if at all? Did you do it in Pennsylvania?
Well, we did not do it in Pennsylvania. I want to give a shout out to one jurisdiction in Pennsylvania, and that's Allegheny County, which includes Pittsburgh, which has really had the distinction of having one leader for their health and human services. For about 20 years, his name is Mark Cherna. And one of Mark's goals in life was really to have an integrated health and human services system. And he's worked very hard, and he has created one office, which is entirely, it's the HIPAA covered entity, includes all the different divisions. And so within this office, they've shared information. But when the judge is referencing, for about 4 years, I was the head of the Child Welfare and Juvenile Justice Services system in Pennsylvania, and I had no access to any of my brother or sister agency information. And it was extraordinarily frustrating because I was in charge of making sure that children were safe and secure in their homes, and I was in charge of returning children to homes and making a determination that it's safe and secure when I was solely dependent on that parent agreeing to tell me the situation. Judge Capizzi and I met on another national project, and we bonded quickly because he and I both saw the solution to this national project of being one case at a time. And instead of the big ideas, we better make sure we're having an impact family by family. So I'm thrilled that with my work under Stewards of Change, I can now work with jurisdictions like Pennsylvania, like California and Virginia and Connecticut under the NIC project, and local jurisdictions like the Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust, which is a group of 3 counties in California, Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, and San Mateo, that have come together and said, look, we need to have information from different systems, from different jurisdictions, because our families, the families that are receiving public services, are very mobile. And like the judge said, they know if they cross a border, it's almost like a clean slate.
Right.
It's very frustrating to a caseworker, whether that caseworker is in child welfare, juvenile justice, behavioral health, or a counselor in a school, when they see a family needing help, escaping that help by crossing a border. So confidentiality is one of the reasons why we're still working on data sharing. But it's not the only reason. It may be the reason given, but there's a lot of organizational change management that has to occur, and feeling of trust between systems before information can really be shared.
Thank you. Mike, you're from the largest state around and have been in this for a long time. How do you use data sharing to effectuate change?
So I'd like to say we'd figured it out.
Okay. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
Tell us the answer. California's always first.
It's not
Okay.
true. So 8 years ago when I became Undersecretary, we were in the middle of a bad recession, making some very painful cuts in Health and Human Services. And as I was walking through those reductions with the secretary at the time, we got to the end, and she looked at me and said, well, what's the cumulative effect? And so I started to talk about what the overall numbers look like, number of families, dollars. And so that's not what I want to know. What I really want to know is, we talked about cuts in Medicaid, we talked about cuts in TANF, and in-home supportive services. How many families are we hitting 5 times?
Put up your slide.
Okay. And I said, I honestly can't answer that. I can tell you on average what a family that's on Medicaid in California is making, and based on that, the likelihood that they're getting a SNAP benefit, the likelihood that they're getting in-home supportive services, but I can't actually do a data run and tell you how many families we're impacting on all of those. And 8 years later, we're still not there. And it's really at the county level that we're seeing some of the most progress being made in this area. So Richard was just talking about the Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust. That's one of the examples. San Diego is probably the other, where they're furthest along in bringing their different data sets together and really getting a client view of what's going on. At the state level, we just don't have that at the moment. We have brought together all the departments in my agency, and we have a data use agreement now between the 12 departments. So really, more importantly than anything else in that data use agreement is the idea that we should be sharing information between our departments, and that we should be looking for insights into our clients' lives.
Like, how have you dealt with interoperability? I'm assuming all these counties have had different systems.
Yeah. So on interoperability, it's so far when I talk to folks, it's really not the technology aspect of it that's the problem. It's really the culture and the desire to share information and breaking that down. And so that's where I say, like, the data use agreement and the statement that you should be sharing information. We shouldn't be siloing ourselves. The fact that there is a governance process that then comes up to me when there's a dispute, so that somebody that's just saying, I just don't want to share, and they're using things like HIPAA as the excuse for not sharing,
Right.
we can then actually look at that and say, that's actually, you can share that, and you should be sharing that, and get past that cultural idea. We've started putting together use cases. So the one that's up right now is something that we've been doing with CalFresh, which is our SNAP program in California, WIC, and then using Medicaid data as well. So we had to pull together data from 3 different departments to come up with this. And what you're looking at are census tract level in LA County, what the people are who are WIC only, who may be eligible for CalFresh. And so we're going through county by county, looking at CalFresh and WIC enrollment rates, and trying to figure out which counties are doing a good job of enrolling in both programs, which are doing better in one or the other, and which are doing poorly in both. And we often get asked by counties what we do with the information that we get, and quite often the answer is we don't know, we just collect it. So this is an example where we're pulling that information together, putting it together at a census tract level, giving it back to the counties. And so that actually the next slide then has we take that information and we then look at the percentage of dual enrollment at the census tract level. And we also took some other information and said, what's the likely enrollment capacity of that particular census tract? And so the red areas are the ones that have the lowest enrollment compared to their potential. And those we then tell the county, that's where you should be concentrating your outreach. Instead of doing county-wide sorts of outreach, focus in on the areas where you're going to have the most potential for getting the most people enrolled in these programs and get people food benefits that they really need. So this is where we're starting to see at the state level where we can have impact, and by encouraging the counties to actually look at things. But we're also seeing individually some of the counties starting to do this sort of pulling information together, but it really takes leadership, and it takes pushing people out of their silos and to really think about the client rather than their programs. And what I've started telling people is that, government by necessity silos itself. We create bureaucracies so that we can actually administer programs, and that's fine, it's historical, but our clients' lives aren't siloed. And so it's up to us then to figure out how to go across those silos and get that client level view that we need to actually help people, and to expect people that are in need to figure out how to go across our silos is just insane.
Right. I can tell you as a judge, I didn't go to school to learn how to exchange information. And I expect experts to tell me how to do that. They always tell me, Judge, we can't exchange medical information. Everything's frozen. HIPAA's going to freeze you out. And I've learned over the last 20 years doing this that you can exchange if you do it the appropriate way. And so these systems help us, but as you're working with decision makers around the country, their perception is that they can't exchange anything. Their perception is they can't, especially, exchange medical information. And so as you're going to clients or going to individuals all over the country, you really need to educate them from the bottom up that although there's HIPAA regulations, all kinds of rules, they're there to be strict, but they're not there to deny. It's just a matter of how you use them properly. So, Mary-Sara, you're coming from a different perspective. And I should say that she is a star replacement here today. And I thought you were going to mention that yourself, but she didn't. We were supposed to have today Stuart Vensky, and Stuart wasn't able to be here because of another crisis, I guess. And so we are so lucky to have Mary-Sara here to tell us about the perspective you may have in this issue.
Well, I think the question of a single view, which is, I would say, is what you're getting at there,
Yes.
Is something that we found a lot of interest. Clients have a lot of interest in developing a single view, and exactly what that means is going to differ from client to client. We speak about a 360-degree view of the person, but I think most often it's more about 90 to 100 degrees. There's some clients are doing interesting things, though, and there's different ways to go about this. But I think the first challenge that we're having is really normalizing that data and being able to resolve the identities across systems. And the technologies exist to do that. And so historically, that was the real challenge. And we can get by that now. And so I think the next step is really about then what kind of access controls do we put on top of that? And we start thinking about that. It's really a question about what information are you sharing with whom for what reason? And if we start decoupling data from systems, which is one of the things that the County of San Diego did really well. For example, mental health is one of the examples of data that's often difficult to share. However, there's data in the mental health system that is not difficult to share. It doesn't need to be protected. For example, a person's status as a veteran, which can help place them with benefits and can be shared across different caseworkers. So decoupling the data from systems has been really important. Another aspect is thinking about what is the purpose of the sharing. So LA County has a multidisciplinary team protocol that they passed, which allows during the 30 days of a child welfare investigation, they have access to an extended amount of information. So then it's just a matter of how do we manage that. So we're working with them to develop a mobile device that allows a caseworker to do a person search. So first you're able to identify that unique individual, and then you have the criminal justice information, you've got all of the warrants, you've got the mental health, you have the physical health information, you have all of the county information essentially that exists on that individual, which is going to protect the caseworker and more importantly protect the child so that you can better assess if that child is safe in the home or not. And the caseworker has that in a single view on their device in the field. So I think there's some really innovative ways that that clients are identifying this. Richard mentioned the Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust, and they are working on legislation that is going to allow sharing across education, criminal justice, social services, healthcare, across counties. And so that's going to be really important as people have mentioned, as families move, as children change school district, to be able to support their success.
Thank you. Alison, how do you fit in all this? Your role is just an amazing, you and I talked earlier today for a little while, and your career has changed so dramatically and in such an interesting way. And so can you pull yourself into this discussion? You're supposed to be responding to what they have said. So now I'm going to ask you, please respond.
Sure, I'll try. So, I mean, I think a couple threads, right? There's like the client view, which is really critical, and I don't mean to diminish that at all, but there's also the population health view, and I feel like that's where I've spent more time lately, and it's population health defined not by the panel that's defined by a specific provider, nor by necessarily a very large geographic region. So the communities that we've been working with closely for the last couple of years, actually, we asked them to define their remit fairly narrowly. But there's been tremendous power in showing slides like the one you had there, but for a neighborhood. or for a very small subset of people who hit multiple systems very frequently, and the community is really trying to get sort of a map of how they're moving, where there are points of opportunity and intersection to share data, or to even identify where there's data being collected. So I think a lot of the work that we've been doing is really helping people even define the data they have at their disposal at the community level, which cuts across a number of different sectors, and then work to figure out what are the opportunities to better connect and find points of intersection so that you can have impact, not just at the individual level, but also at the community level where you can take some action. And I was really intrigued, Mary, by your point about the technology being there for helping people reconcile matching, individual matching, because I will say of the 10 communities that we've worked with as part of CHP for the last 18 months, those with an active health information exchange in their community have a mechanism for doing that, and that's the service that is finally, there's a business case, right, to support that. I mean, it was 7 or 8 years a little late, but there are starting to be many more viable business cases for effective HIEs. In the communities, or even the sort of smaller little c community that I'm referencing, in many cases where there is no viable HIE, they're struggling to figure out, what's the solution that I don't necessarily have the bandwidth or the capacity to vet like all of the vendors that come out of the woodwork saying, whoa, have we got the software for you, right? Nor do they necessarily have the capacity to determine what would be the most appropriate solution that allows them to sort of scale at the reasonable price, et cetera. So I think the other role that we've played is trying to sort of be an information intermediary and broker to try to help connect people with other resources, human or otherwise, so that they can find people who are trying to solve similar problems and at least investigate some of the strategies that they've used, some of them having to do with software, some not. So, for example, using that case, we had a community in Vermont that had used a software platform, and early on in the program, another community got wind of that, and it turned out that that would very nicely fit their needs. And so there was like a trusted community-based person to say, yes, this is worth looking into. Here are the questions you should ask. Here are the things we didn't like about the way it worked. And here's how you should go forward. But that sort of identity solution and the wraparound software solution was kind of a lucky hit for us. But I think there's many more who don't know necessarily where to go for those types of core services.
Right. Go ahead and respond.
I think it's important to note that there is information sharing going on everywhere, in every jurisdiction, HIPAA, FERPA aside. Right now, someone picks up the phone and calls someone that they know in another system and says, "Hi, Tony, it's Richard. How you doing? How are the kids? Do you have a good weekend? Listen, could you do me a favor and just check your system for, I'm looking for a Mike Wilkening," okay? And, I've known Tony for 25 years, and I know that he's about to retire, and I know I'm about to retire from my lips to God's ears. And we trust each other. So I'm going to find out that information based on the relationship. HIPAA, the HIPAA's there. HIPAA's right on top of Tony, okay? But there's trust. So let's stop playing a game as if we're not sharing information and admit it. So my hypothetical to you is, what if Mike Wilkening had the power, which he does, and I'm teasing, the all-powerful Mike Wilkening, to take the California Health and Human Services Agency, is that I got that right. And say, we're not going to have silos anymore. We're going to reorganize our agency so that one person in our agency serves all the services for a client. So if they want WIC, if they want TANF, if they want this, if they're involved in child welfare, if they're involved in mental health, we are going to have one generalist case manager. Guess what? That case manager is going to know everything from every system. Unless he's going to say, or she's going to say, oh, I can't share that with myself because that's HIPAA. So, and think from a consumer point of view. Wouldn't they rather deal with one person instead of 7 people in 7 different offices telling them to do 7 different things? You know, we all live with our iPhones and our calendars, and we, even though we're pretty sophisticated, we screw up sometimes and don't go to a meeting or we're late to this. You should see the calendars of the clients we serve.
You're assuming they have a calendar.
Well,
I'm just, you know.
And where we expect them to go on a daily basis, and when they fail to go, they become uncooperative. That's what the system calls it. So in front of Judge Capizzi's, he'll have a caseworker who says, "Mom's been uncooperative for the last 4 months." What that means is he or she isn't going to the appointments. Well, maybe she's trying to do other things, and it's not that she's neglecting her children. She's trying to better her life, but she just can't make all the appointments. So there are different ways of looking at these barriers, and we really need to look at them in order to overcome the real barriers, overcome the false barriers, the ones that we've put up, just so that we don't have to deal with each other. Last night, a good person said, hey, our data is so dirty, we don't want to share it with someone else. Okay? Well, that was a really honest statement. Because they'd be embarrassed sharing that data, because that other system's going to say, how in the world do they operate with such bad data? They do. So that system may give a HIPAA answer as to why not share, just so that you don't see their dirty data.
You know, when I'm on the bench and somebody hasn't showed up, and the probation officer says, well, we need to put him in jail, issue the warrant, and I think about that.
How about if lawyers don't? You never put a
I love
lawyer
putting
in
lawyers in jail. But the reality is, when I get my hair cut every 3 weeks, I get a phone call that says, Tony, your appointment's tomorrow at 10:30, make sure you show up. And if I'm going to the doctor, I get a phone call now. So even though I keep a calendar, I still need someone to remind me what I'm supposed to do the next day. And these people don't. And if we don't exchange information like this, if we don't break down the different silos, it's an ongoing struggle, because then I see these people who I assume are doing something wrong. But frankly, they are trying to get bus money to get their kid to school the next day. They are worried about when I say you need to bring your child for drug treatment twice a week for the next 18 months. You know, and it may be 8 miles away. They're like, how am I going to get my kid there? They're worried about electricity. They're worried about all kinds of issues. So as we bring all these issues together, if we don't work together like Richard talks about, breaking down all these silos, we can find ways to help a variety of people. And, you know, I know we have a very affluent society for part of our country. But there's a substantial part of our country that isn't affluent, that needs our support. And this type of data and information sharing really can effectuate change in that community, which can make a difference long term. And so, Mike, you are focused, of course, in California and have had challenges all through the system. Have you been able to work on the issue interoperability? Now, we know technology can solve it. But what about the money issues related to it? What about the mindset that it can't be done? How do you deal with that?
So the biggest challenge really is the mindset, and it's working through cultural change issues and trying to get people, I think the easiest way that I've found so far to deal with this is to talk about the client. And to remind people that they aren't doing work for a program. That's not what they're there for. They're really there to provide services for clients. And so if we continue to think about the programs, then it's easy to have all these barriers and to think about the funding constraints and the legal impediments. And I mean, the list is never ending as to why you continue to remain siloed. And why you should be spending your time making sure that your program's the best program, and I don't have time to talk to the people over in social services, and it's just a non-ending sort of a discussion that will just dishearten you very quickly. But if you pivot that conversation and continue to say, yeah, but it's not about TANF. We really aren't talking about TANF here. TANF is one aspect of this person's life. And what we need to be thinking about is what that client needs. And you need to be sharing your information with Medicaid so that we can actually get a better picture of what that is, and we can do a better job of providing services for that person. Those are the conversations that I think are the most fruitful at this point, and that really help to move us past those, really they're false barriers, right. Especially once we had the technology to do this integration. That's, you can't say it can't be done. Now it's, I don't want to do it.
Thank you. Go ahead and respond, Alison.
So I just wanted to pick up on that a little bit, because I think sometimes the narrative can be, it's a mindset, it's a culture change, and there's people who are just willfully being jerks, right? And I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think what we have failed to do systemically is tap into people's desire and need to be helpful and to help identify and present opportunities in a way that helps to solve real problems. And so a lot of the work that we've done is help people get over the fear or the anxiety about the dirty data they sit on, because it may be perfectly useful for the one use case that they need it to fulfill. It might be really poor for the multiple other use cases that you would envision if you could share it with other sources of data and apply it to derive intelligence for a number of things that you want it to do for population health. But I think a lot of the work that I've done, and I think a lot of the work that people are increasingly doing, is almost helping people to strategically identify a pathway for growth that allows them to jump over the hurdles or get beyond the hurdle of fear and mistrust, and work toward really identifying what they have and viewing it as an asset, and then also figuring out the value and all of the different value that could be derived by the multiple end users, because they may only see the one value stream that they've always seen until they're exposed to people from a number of other sectors or organizations. They don't necessarily understand all of the different value streams that come to play.
Thank you. I understand. Go ahead, Mary-Sara.
And I wanted to just comment on there. I think some people, there is a definite fear and a very strong concern about sharing data. And I think in most cases, people really do believe that they're protecting the client in doing that. But over and above that, I think because of the way we've organized our programs historically, there's also an expertise issue. And so having a single caseworker across all the programs, a generalist, is a nice idea, but we lack workers who have depth of expertise across all of those programs, and that becomes a real challenge. So there's a knowledge issue, and then there's also a collaboration and coordination issue. So I think in addition to talking about sharing data and connecting different programs from a data perspective, we need to connect different programs from a people perspective and start having this community that is working together, not just looking at the same thing. And I think when we do that, we're really going to start empowering that data, and then we can get to some of the organizational change that Richard and Mike are speaking about.
You know, I can tell you from every day, all these different tracks of people that I want to work with, be they public health, education, social service, probation, they don't trust each other. So I think that's why we've created all these silos, because people won't exchange information. So we have technology, and you just sort of talked about it. We have technology, but there's a mindset change. You know, I have people that come in front of me who know information on a case, and they don't want to tell anybody else but me. They will not exchange that information with each other. And so it's more than a technology issue, and I'm so glad you brought that up. It's that mindset that, you know what, it's all right to exchange information. Our focus is on the children and families or whatever system we're working in. But to do that, you have to change that mindset. And so how's IBM doing that?
Well,
Go ahead. You're going to get her off that one, all right.
yeah, I saw Mary go like that. So I'll jump in and use the Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust again. You're going to be sick and tired of hearing about them, but I don't care. Right now, what they have done with 4 different systems, education, which having education as its core is extraordinarily unique when dealing with data sharing, because education has been one of those parties that have said, no go, we don't share. But it's education, child welfare, juvenile justice, and behavioral health. And the leaders of these systems in these 3 counties have empowered and delegated and designated case management teams. These are people, line workers and supervisors, who are meeting with us to really figure out what is the data that we need in order to improve outcomes. And it's a lot of hard work. People are being very critical about what they need, and they're being honest. We don't need that, or we don't want a 10-page document when we only want one thing. And what is public? In other words, it's not confidential information that we could get to get our answer. And then it's who needs this data in each system. Because a teacher in a school may not need to know that a kid is on probation. But maybe a counselor in a school needs to know, or a vice principal needs to know. So it's really figuring out what are the data elements that's to be shared, and with whom, and why. Because the reason must be to improve the outcomes for services for the families, and no other reason. And so it's a hard process, a difficult process, but one that's really bearing fruit, because we see people sitting in a room who've never sat in a room together. And not only are they learning about data, but they're learning about each other's systems, and they're recognizing what they don't know about each other's systems that they really want to know. And this is the beginning, I think, of an organizational change management, because they've been under this misimpression that this other system has information that, in fact, they don't have. And it's been a real education for these line workers and supervisors that will trickle up the systems at the same time that we're working with the leaders in doing data sharing agreements and things like that will trickle down. So it's a two-way, vertical as well as horizontal process.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mary-Sara.
I think if we shift the conversation, when we talk about data sharing, people get lost. It's kind of like, how do you eat an elephant? It's enormous. And so if we bring it down to specific use cases, which built on what Richard was saying, it's not how do we share data across the board, it's how do I share data during the child investigation with the investigator. So it becomes very specific. Now that's tackleable. And if you build the infrastructure to support that, as you expand your use cases, you can keep sharing the data, but you've got to have those use cases to make it tangible. If you begin with, I want to share data because it can improve outcomes, it's too amorphic, and you're going to run into a lot of issues and a lot of perceived challenges that may not really be there. And if you ground it, then I think that's when you can get behind that child, you can get behind that family, because it becomes very specific. So I think perhaps the way we talk about it is really helpful.
Thank you. I want to throw
Yes, sir.
some data out and then just
Okay.
answer it quick. The difference between big data and smart data. In 2016, United States, there are 204 million emails every minute. There are 277,000 tweets every minute. Now with 17 and the president, that may go up another 10 or 20 million. But in reality, there are 277,000 tweets every minute in the United States. There are 2.5 million shared contacts on Facebook every minute. And there are 216 pictures put on Instagram every minute. So that is big data. And we started talking about is what smart data. How do you figure out what you need? Then how do you use it? And in the end, you should be using smart data to focus on the purpose of what you need. It gives you insight if you know to drain down from the top down to the bottom, and then what actions and the resulting solutions to it. So we all have challenges with big data. And you started touching about how we turn that into smart data. We figure out what our needs are, and then we try to find an answer to it. Does that help you?
It does. I think, the question that I think you have to start with is to what end? Why are you doing what you're doing? And so if the answer is to share data, you're never going to get anywhere.
Right.
There are costs and there are challenges, and they are real. And so if you don't have a purpose in doing this, you'll never get past those. Because HIPAA's real. And if you don't have a particular use that you're trying to get to, a particular result, you can't overcome HIPAA. You just won't. You won't.
Legally.
Legally, right. You just.
I mean, because Richard talked about how, I'm not supposed to know a lot of things, but I can make a phone call to somebody, and because of that personal relationship, I got information. But again, we're not supposed to be doing that, and I never, ever do that. But at the same time, I'm looking at the risk of the life of a child. And so probably someone on my behalf makes those kinds of calls.
And I should say systemically as well, is that, the one-offs you're going to have, but systemically, you're not going to get past that.
Correct.
You just won't. And you will overcome that because of your personal relationship, but you're not going to overcome it on a generalized systemic basis.
Not efficient.
Yeah, you have to have a real use case. And you aren't going to get policymakers to buy in. There's just, when somebody comes to a policymaker and just talks about sharing data, I mean, they're going to glaze over. They don't care about that, most of them. And really, honestly, shouldn't, unless you have some reason that you're trying to share the data. Because there are risks and there are costs associated with that. And so you really need to be able to articulate what is that use case that you're bringing forward, and then people can rally around that, and they can overcome challenges, and they can find creative ways to get you to the place that everyone agrees that you need to be. But it has to start with that to what end question.
Right, Richard, I think you and I can both respond to that and say, from our perspective, if I just tell a story, an anecdotal story about a child who, because I didn't have information about that child, they're now dead. That mother has lost 4 children in the next county. They were removed from her, so she moved to my county to have the baby. And she's had 3 prior drug-addicted children, and she goes half a mile across the county line, and has a child in my court, and that child dies because I didn't get that information. That's the real-life scenario, which I use with policymakers all the time to say, that's why I need this. Because if you don't give a reason, reality sets in and they're like, why? Why change anything? Go ahead.
Well, so I was just going to build a little bit more on the points about going from sort of big data to smart data, because I think we also need to move towards smart systems, which, I completely agree. And I actually feel in hindsight like the whole quality improvement movement was totally laudable, right? But it was too big to be an expression of importance for data sharing, right? It's too vague. I don't know what that means practically. It's not discrete and specific enough. And so here we find ourselves, sort of roughly 8 years later, learning the hard lesson again, that it needs to be actually a very specific problem that you want to solve. But in solving that very specific problem, in identifying that use case, you also need to think about how that fits into the system that you envision for the long term, and how not to build a system with so much technical debt that you've pretty much shot yourself in the foot and precluded the possibility that you actually build a smart system that allows you to address all of the subsequent use cases that you may want to eventually work toward. So I think right now where we find ourselves is having moved on from the share data for everything, because it's like a good thing to do, to share data for a very specific problem, to thinking about, okay, we know that we want to solve this problem, and we probably want to solve 25 or 35,000 other problems. How do we build a system that allows us to create a pathway to do that the most effectively and efficiently? And I feel like that's, everybody's looking for that golden rainbow right now.
Go ahead, Mary-Sara.
On the smarter systems topic, I think one of the things that's really exciting with cognitive is now the ability to kind of democratize expertise, if you will, to be able to have systems that really focus on a specific use case, whether it's oncology, whether it's child abuse, that are going to be able to essentially be advisors. They're not making decisions for you or anything to that degree, but it's bringing back all of that, the insights, so that you don't have to sift through all that underlying data. Because one of the things that we run into with big data is that giving you too much is about the same as giving you nothing at all, is that you become unable to move either way. So you need to be given the information that's necessary to take action. And I think we're in an era right now where that's becoming very possible.
Yeah, I think later this morning or early this afternoon, I'm going to be part of the panel, another panel. I'm going to show you how I've been using IBM Watson in my court to try and actually focus on that. There's so much data, and how am I able to use a system like Watson to make a difference in what I do every day. So stay tuned for this afternoon to see how that works and how we take that huge amount of data and bring it down. And one more point, judges around the country get scared when they hear all these issues, all these points, because they say, well, I'm supposed to make the decision. You're not. The cognitive ability of Watson and whatever is supposed to give me, in the end, the decision. That's what people are afraid of. And all it really does is it gives me more quality information from which to make my own decision. And so as we discuss these fears, well, as we discuss the technology, because we know the technology's there, you're all accomplishing that, we've sort of touched on the re-education of the society to make a difference, because the biggest barrier will be the human factor that won't use it or they're afraid to use it. And so, Richard, from your perspective, how do we educate the masses that the data's available, technology's there, we can help you focus, but you got to use it?
Well, I think that we could be talking about different generations as well.
Okay.
The person coming into the workforce today expects this kind of technology, expects, they grew up with it, they're proficient with it, they're familiar with it, they're not scared of it. They're the children we go to say, now how do I do this? And my daughter says, I'm not going to tell you again how to get iTunes. It's not even relevant anymore, Dad. And I still want iTunes, and she says, I'm not doing it. I did it 4 times. You never did it, and that's it. So I reminded her who paid her college education, and she went to her mother. And so, you know, it's the administrator. It's my generation and maybe younger who still is we're computer savvy, but we're still computer scared in a sense. So I think that we would have a welcoming workforce. I think that a lot of the young people going into Health and Human Services today, they're shocked about the primitive tools that we're giving them to use, and it's a disincentive for them to commit to a lifetime working here. So I'm less concerned about that, and I think that my generation needs to retire soon, and the next generation will see a need to have that technology. So,
All right, we've talked about the issues.
We need to become judges.
Right,
one of those.
That's right. Talked about technical issues. Talked about some cultural issues. Let's talk about the legal issues, privacy issues. You see,
Well,
no. Yeah, so clearly, from my perspective, I get told all the time, "Oh my God, you can't look at that. It's against the law to have access to that data." There's all kinds of challenges I hear all the time, and it was touched on earlier about the privacy issues. So how do we overcome that? How have you overcome it?
So the best way to overcome the legal confidentiality issues is, again, the organizational change management. If the systems that's going to be sharing specific data with specific people for specific purposes understands why they're sharing data and that it is for a positive reason, a client can always be given the opportunity to consent. And there are very limited exceptions where a client cannot consent to sharing data.
But wait a minute. The clients we deal with, they'll sign anything you put in front of them. And so there's an abuse of that. Sign everything. And so
I don't want to do that.
All right, it's not an educated release. But
I understand. But it's not an educated release because it's pro forma. It's at the intake, and we give them 10 pieces of paper that are blank to say, and we say, just sign them. We may need to use them in the future. That's not good practice. It never has been good practice, but that's practice.
And as a judge, defense lawyers come into me in court and say, well, exactly what he just said, restrict all of it from the court proceeding. Think about that, because if it's not an educated release of information that's signed, it gets excluded a lot, which affects my cases, because I have a child in front of me who maybe I have to decide if they go home with a person who's going to abuse that child or not, and I have to not let information in because it was improperly signed. But anyways.
So, Judge, if I may, other than one person in this audience, because I know one person will raise her hand, so Kate McAvoy cannot raise her hand. Kate McAvoy from Connecticut, she cannot raise her hand. How many of you, the last time you went to the doctor's office, read your HIPAA statement that you signed? Oh, you did not.
I'm going to hold you to contempt of court for that answer.
Oh, stop it. He wouldn't take the time. He's too impatient.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it.
Other than Kate, and she did it. And boy, if I had been behind Kate trying to sign in and she's reading that HIPAA statement, I would have been cussing her terrible. So we have gotten used to signing things too, because it's become rote. So we don't know actually how our medical information in that doctor is going to be used, because it's in that HIPAA statement. whether they can sell my name or my information for research purposes, or whether they can give it to someone else. It's in that notice that I didn't sign, that I didn't read, but I signed. So we've become a culture of uninformed consent.
True.
I'm talking about informed consent. I'm talking about the systems really creating a relationship, a trust relationship with that client, which sometimes that's a difficult process, but until we create that trust relationship, it's been proven again and again that we don't get the positive results.
Okay. Alison?
I just wanted to offer a couple of specific examples where we've seen that actually happen at the community level. So one of the communities that we've worked with is in a rural part of very northern California in Humboldt County. And there the project was really trying to deal with the impact of homelessness, incarceration, and substance abuse, and persistent behavioral health needs. And so it was a coordination between the local HIE, the county, and then a sort of wraparound shelter and service provider. And the folks there actually worked with that service provider to review their consent process, and then to figure out how to build in the language that they would need in order to share certain data elements. Again, but going back to your comments about parsimony being really critical, but thinking about the data elements that they would need to add, and the language that would make the most sense. And then they worked with actual members of the community who receive services and with the caseworkers and reviewed the process. And we're working with them right now to develop sort of a little, two-pager on this experience. But the consent document and the resources and the materials that came out of that are very different from the version 1.0 that they started with, but it allowed them to devise a consent strategy that actually everybody's comfortable with. It provided an opportunity for bidirectional education, and it also provided a mechanism for them to build trust relationships. So it's like a win-win-win on all three fronts, and now they're actually actively sharing data, and there's tremendous demand from other members of the community to figure out how to tap into that. So I just wanted to offer that. It can be done.
Thanks. Well, Mike's first, and then we're going to go to Mary-Sara.
Yeah, and I think one thing to recognize is that your attorneys are going to default to no.
Right.
They're going to start at it can't be done. And so your starting point has to be the answer is yes and how. And when they keep coming back with no and you keep saying no, the answer is yes, go and figure out how. Eventually what you get into is that you can get to yes and there's risk mitigation around it. And that allows them to do their due diligence and to really tell you what the legal thresholds are that you're dealing with. Most of this is gray. This is not black and white in most cases. And so you're really dealing in the gray. And so it's really figuring out what's the risk that you're taking here and how do you mitigate that risk. And once you have that sort of a conversation, it opens up a lot of different possibilities. I've had attorneys that have just told me flat out, no, that can't be done. And so it's great, show me the law. Let's actually pull the statute out and you show me where it says I can't do that. I said, I expect when you come in here that you're going to provide me with legal and policy advice, but I expect you to know the difference between the two and not to give me policy advice and tell me that it's your legal advice.
Lawyers don't want to be sued. They want to make all the money, but they don't want to work. And I did it for a long time. And they're going to say no, so they don't have to do the effort to get you in trouble to pull you out of it, especially public sector lawyers. Private sector, you can make a lot of money. The public sector, you're being paid your salary. And so public sector lawyers, generally speaking, are no, everything asked for by a policy person simply because they don't want to do the extra work. Now, I know, Mary-Sara, you were next. You're going to say something. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Typically, when we talk about data sharing, people talk about, start with the question of what data needs to be protected. And we spend a lot of time figuring out what needs to be protected and under what situations can we share that. If we start at the other end of the spectrum and say, what data can we share? You can go a long way before you get to, and now we need to start protecting. So if we just change where we start the discussion, let's talk about what we can share. And what we can share, instead of just breaking it into what do I have access to by virtue of my role, and what do I have access to by virtue of consent, open it up a little bit more. So what do I have access to by virtue of my role? What additional data exists that is not included within my department that I could access because there's no privacy issues with my accessing that. So figuring out what is all of that data that's available. And some of the systems that we've been putting in place, they have a three-tiered access policy to them, or access structure, so that it's role-based, and then it's policy-based, and then it's consent-based. And the consent-based is hopefully consent. And if that doesn't work, if that's still not enough data, they still do have the ability to break the glass, in which case bells go off, whistles, everybody's informed, there are reports. So it's completely apparent that they have accessed data that under their role, the policy, and consent, they would not be able to access. But if you were having somebody at your desk having a seizure, you would need access to that data, and it would be permissible, and so they have the ability to do that. So I think if we break it down into parts like that, it becomes a lot more addressable.
You know, one of the results of 9/11 was that the Attorney General started an organization called Global. And I met Paul Wormley, who was on the board with me, probably 14 years ago, as we got together as appointees by the U.S. Attorney, basically, to try and create an information exchange network. At that point, it was police, fire, it really was everybody that had access to information, public side. And we have, over the years, created all the technology, I believe, and Paul's much better on the technology side than I am. But through Global, we've come up with privacy guidelines. We came up with, okay, you have a use. And let's talk about, in one area of use, I'll give an example. Charging, police department, what do we charge for? Who do we charge? And we created the network and created the software that makes that system work better. I know Paul and I had a discussion last night that there's some new issues dealing with technology. And Paul's frustration to me is like, Tony, they're recreating the wheel. We've done all this work. For the last 15 years, Global has created the ability to exchange information safely. I led the effort about 5 years ago to create a whole set of privacy guidelines that we'll talk about, I think, over lunch if anyone wants to hear. But we have met a lot of those challenges, and really, you know, I had a dual problem when I was on that committee and chaired that committee. Because on the one hand, I had the prosecutor side of life saying, okay, we just stopped a car with 23 kilos, or a truck with 23 kilos of heroin. And society said that if we can get that heroin off the street, let's just break all the laws. The police department would say, we don't care about the law, let's get rid of the heroin. And so if in fact they collect it, even though it's thrown out in court, they've got the heroin off the street. So there's that mindset. And so it was our role as part of Global is to teach agencies you can deal with privacy issues, but still not break the law. And I think we've accomplished those objectives. We have found ways to protect individuals' rights in all areas if we just spend the time. And so as we work this issue, we don't have to recreate the wheel all the time. There are amazing guidelines already in place that the Attorney General eventually issued. I think it was signed off on about 3 years ago. We have some great guidelines on privacy issues and exchange of information. So now, Mary-Sara, you wanted to say something?
Well, I think there's a lot of reuse opportunities that we tend to overlook because we think, oh, my situation is different, that's not going to apply here. And there's so many challenges that each of you has solved. And probably some aspect of that solution that you came up with, whether it be the organizational or the process or the technology, that is going to be shareable or reusable by another organization. And so I think one of the values that we get out of a network of networks is just the people factor, that we need to start reusing each other's solutions. And you can break it down into parts. I was speaking with someone last night, and I was talking about a solution that didn't completely fit their needs, but maybe the consent aspect fit their needs, or maybe the collaboration aspect fit their needs. So again, instead of looking at it as a whole, being able to look at those aspects, did they solve something that you're currently working on, and can you take that and use it as a starting point?
Thank you.
And
Richard?
if I could just have 2 points. One is that the current technology enables us to share data in an interoperable manner. At the same time, the current technology creates tremendous security for that data. And we can ensure people that the data will remain secure in ways that we've never been able to do in the past. So it helps in both sharing and protecting. And the second thing is about how do we change the culture? And I want to just bring it back to something that Daniel and Margot said at the beginning of today, which is the National Interoperability Collaborative and the Kresge Grant is going to enable us to develop some curriculum. And one of our ideas is we've done decades of training on how to keep information confidential and not share. How about now training people, how do you share properly information within your job responsibilities? So we are looking at developing a confidentiality curriculum that would be applicable in different jurisdictions, and that's one other way of changing the culture.
Thank you. I want to open it up to the floor a little, and we'll probably run out of mics, but does anyone have a question for anybody on the panel? Come on now, there's got to be some interesting idea that you want to tell us about. Anybody in the audience doing something in this area that you feel is important? Yes, ma'am, go right ahead. You may need there's one mic, okay.
So I'm Kate McAvoy from Connecticut. I'm the Medicaid director in Connecticut, and I really thank you all very much for an interesting and provocative discussion. I wanted to touch on the last point that Richard made about affirmatively equipping people to understand the nature and the orientation to appropriate disclosure. And I wanted to revisit an earlier point in the discussion, really respectfully push back a little bit on the characterization that the concerns around data sharing have been entirely about risk mitigation. Incidentally, I'm a lawyer, and so I know we have that orientation.
God bless you. I love you.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
Exactly. Not dispositive of my job role, but I do feel that it's useful to examine, in particular as an object lesson, our obligations in Medicaid. We have a federal statute that says it's permissible to share data if it is in the best interests of the members of that program. That's a very interesting and affirmative approach. It does require fidelity to that standard when we're examining how to do that, and I think it dovetails with Richard's orientation, an enabling strategy, but also recognizing the highly prejudicial applications of some of the data, particularly the health data of Medicaid members, and the implications that has for employment prospects, for housing, preclusive, particularly in the housing arena, as that's been interpreted. So I think it is a very useful and provocative discussion to have in terms of that, but I appreciate the sort of applied orientation that Richard brought to that in terms of equipping people. I also want to absolutely affirm Michael's point about distinctions between the legal matters and the policy decisions, because ultimately we have to make informed policy decisions that balance these factors, and I think that that is what we have to reserve as our right when we're equipped with all the rationales. So thank you for the opportunity to comment, and I do feel like this is galvanizing a set of discussions that are going to be useful for the latter stages of the conversation.
Thank you. Respond?
And just to follow up on Kate's comment, we've mentioned HIPAA and we've mentioned FERPA, but there's always the dreaded 42 CFR that applies to drug and alcohol. And there is absolutely no question in my mind that when that was passed, it was truly to protect the person with addiction from consequences of that knowledge being given, the long-term consequences, the unintended consequences, and to enable the person, to break down any barrier to that person receiving treatment. The times are different now, and we've learned more about addiction, and we've seen how addiction and mental health addiction, you know, the whole opioid epidemic that we were discussing before. So we have to look seriously at the 42 CFR and HIPAA and FERPA and, you know, any of these other acronyms and say, if we're doing it in a situation to help a client, where does it prevent us from doing it? You know, I challenge the government attorneys, and I'm proud to say that for a decade I was a government attorney representing the city of Philadelphia. I challenge my fellow government attorneys to show where it's insurmountable barriers, because in very few exceptions, there are legal ways and proper ways and ethical ways, legal and ethical ways of sharing data to help clients.
I know it was mentioned earlier by a few of you, and we won't have time to talk about this big issue, but training, because the quality of information is always of a concern to all of us. So have any of you been able to manage the issue? Technology can get it done. You can convince the policyholders to make a change, but we don't always have people who are skilled who are doing the inputting of information. So there's always a fear of is the quality corrupt, or is it high quality information from which we're making very difficult decisions? And so have any of you stressed or dealt with the issue of training staff in society today to focus better on this technology and to make sure what they input is done properly?
Well, so I think it's partially a training issue, but it's partially a resourcing issue, right? As anybody who works sort of boots on the ground knows, a lot of the human and social service and community-based organizations don't necessarily consider themselves primarily to be data stewards or holders or collectors. They view themselves as being service providers, and in some cases, even fairly large service providers have very rudimentary data collection mechanisms, like Excel spreadsheets that nobody knows the macros for, right? So I think part of it is actually just providing additional support for all of these organizations to, you know, I don't want to say more deeply appreciate, but to actually be able to invest the time that they need to bolster the data infrastructure and resources they have. We didn't have a high tech for the human and social services sector, right? I mean, we spent so much money to invest in healthcare, and there hasn't been anything on the flip side for the other. So I think it's partially a training issue, but it's partially a recognition that there's going to have to be other mechanisms brought to bear to ensure that they can capitalize on the data they have. And to go back actually to a point that was made from one of the tables this morning, to do so in a way that allows them to retain agency on behalf of the people they're serving, and to not just sell the farm to perpetuate or even worsen the current power imbalance. So I think there's a lot of issues to grapple with.
Thank you. Mary-Sara?
I think there's also the data collection tools. They don't always fit within the business processes. So whatever the system is, that whether it's Excel or an integrated eligibility system, they don't always have the data collection aspects that are consistent with the business processes. And but they could. You know, that's not a necessity. That's a lack of design and process reengineering. And so I think you can address or reduce the training challenges and some of the resource issues if you spend a little bit more time doing that process redesign and making sure that the technology and the business processes are symbiotic.
Mike, I'm going to sort of ask you the last question because I'm running out of time. I work with judges all over the country, and LA County, I've been told, is literally the third largest of the United States because of its size. If you add the people up in LA County, it's bigger than 47 states. And so as I talk to judges from that county and I deal with all these challenges, which are phenomenal challenges, what could you do differently? I mean, you've gotten to a point in California, you've made amazing progress in many areas. Is there something you would have done differently that we can trickle down to smaller states and smaller communities that you think you've learned that you wish you could have done a different way?
I think the conversations, we should have started earlier. We should have started with a broader view of what we were trying to accomplish. Okay. We're kind of focused in on specific areas, and the one that we're making the most progress in is relative to foster care, right, where we really are bringing to bear a lot of different data elements, different views from various agencies, and recognizing, I think that's probably the population where we recognize most clearly all of the different things that are coming to bear on that case. And really the challenge for us is taking that viewpoint and broadening it and recognizing that we have lots of other instances that are coming in front of the courts or various, our social services agencies, where there are a lot of different factors that we don't really know what's going on, and we need to have those insights in order to really make informed decisions.
Yeah, let me give you an example in California I learned when I was here last year. They have so many children in LA County that are in foster care, and the question is, where do you place that child? I mean, I see it every day. I have kids in front of me that I need to place someplace. And so what, in this case, IBM Watson can help do, use the data and deal with the metadata, and maybe say to the judge, you have this child who's this old, their social background, economic background, racial background, religious background, where they live, educational background, and from that information, where are the 3 safest or 15 safest places to send that child to be in foster care? Because as I sit on the bench, I worry all the time. If I place a child in a home, and in my career on the bench, I've had 2 children that we've placed who didn't survive because of where they were placed. And so it's a real life situation. So the technology is being used to give to the court, all right, you have, 3,000 providers in LA County, but which 3 or which 10 are the best? And then we use that information, and the quality's got to be there. I need to trust what I'm getting to be accurate, that they use the right techniques to get me quality information, because it really just helps me. And I use that to make that decision. And so when I see that list, I'm deciding where that child's going to live, be it for 3 months or 3 years. And I'm going to decide maybe if that child's going to go to a home that is already drug infested. And so I need the best data I can get. And through using all these resources we have, the real life difference is that from using that information, I have more information, more quality information from that to make, we hope, the best decision that I can make. And so all this cognitive ability can be scary, but all it really does is it gives us the ability, hopefully, to have better options, a little more background to make a decision on. And so as you keep going through today and tomorrow, you'll hear more examples of how everything we do affects a child and a family. And I know we focus on business sometimes, and we have a lot of business people here, but we're all working together to use this new ability we have to hopefully save children and save families and make the health system work better. So our time is up. I would love you to thank the panel for being here today.